war, and he had just one bargaining chip: Northern Ireland. The man he'd called rat poison was again sent to Dublin to do the deal.
He sent Malcolm MacDonald to negotiate this deal, and with the offer that Irish unity would be declared and that they could draw up a constitution immediately, and basically that the Unionists would have no say in Northern Ireland.
I think the offers of unity that were made at the beginning of the Second World War by the British were probably reasonably serious. You have to remember that if Churchill was prepared to deal with Stalin, he was certainly prepared to deal with DeValera. The war was the absolutely central aim that Churchill had, and I think his loyalty to Northern Ireland Protestants would not have been particularly strong in those circumstances.
This was a historic moment. Even the Unionists in Belfast seemed open to persuasion.
There's even evidence that some of the younger members of the Ulster Unionist cabinet took the view that if Irish neutrality was ended, the great priority was to defeat Hitler, and that they would simply have to accept Irish unity in such a context.
De Valera had the prize of Northern Ireland within his grasp, the avowed goal of his long nationalist struggle. He weighed up the deal and refused it.
It's very striking that De Valera really didn't take those offers seriously or explore them at any level, because what it told you was that ultimately De Valera was a Southern Irish Catholic leader representing the Southern Irish state.
The reality for De Valera was that if more than 800,000 Northern Protestants were suddenly added to the electorate, his party, with its Catholic, rural, Celtic values, could find its political majority obliterated.
Well, I think De Valera certainly wanted a united Ireland, but whether he was prepared to pay the price for it, which would have been a much more pluralist, a much less Catholic, less Gaelic state, whether he was prepared to pay that price for it is another question. And in a way, he wasn't. So to that extent, he can be faulted. But I'll tell you, above all, he wanted the custody of the aspiration to unity, because he knew there were much more dangerous forces potentially at work, Northern Republicans amongst them. And he wanted to make that promise. He had to maintain the custody of the aspiration to Irish unity. And one might say that he rendered that into a permanently postponable aspiration.
At this crucial moment in the war, with the Battle of Britain far from won, there is another reason why the offer may have seemed pointless.
Now, the trouble is, at that time, both Winston Churchill and Eamon DeValera were fairly sure that the war was lost, that the Battle of Britain could not be won. So, if I were Eamon DeValera at that time, and I'm not privy to his mind, I would say, why negotiate with a defeated opponent? Why not wait for the real negotiator, which will be Uncle Adolf in London in December?
For the rest of 1940 and 1941, U-boats preyed on the Atlantic convoys, and a German victory was still a real possibility. British attitudes were hardening.
Once Churchill started to say that Allied convoys were sinking and Allied seamen, British seamen, dying because the Irish would not let the British use those ports, the whole tenor of British propaganda turned against Ireland very viciously.
The German-style helmet saves them from the embarrassment of looking British. The gallant 7,000 have read that there's a war on, and other volunteers are doing home guard duty, less to stop 2 million Nazis dropping from the sky than to raise Cain should a British destroyer stray within territorial limits.
So from that moment onwards, Ireland was not going to get a nice press in World War II.
Don't let history say that De Valera unknowingly helped Hitler to fill the bloodbath of the New Order.
But in November 1941, Churchill made another offer.
About 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard cars, which I thought was odd, and I got up and went out into the landing, and there I saw my father in his dressing gown without his spectacles, and he was crossing the cord on his dressing gown, and rather sharply he said, "Go back to your room and do not come out unless I send for you." Well, that was the famous telegram.
The cryptic telegram that had arrived from Churchill at the dead of night was short. It read, "Now is your chance. Now or never. A nation once again." But this time Churchill wasn't making a serious offer of reunification. Earlier that day, the Americans had entered the war. A jubilant Churchill was taunting De Valera for staying on the fence.
Now that the whole free world is in arms, the time has come to say to Era, forget your trouble with England, at least till after the war. Era, like the rest of us, will go under if the Nazis win.
In fact, Irish neutrality continued to be substantially pro-Allied. The Irish discreetly handed over information to the British wherever possible. But a final disastrous gaffe was to tarnish Ireland's neutrality forever. In April 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the shattered city of Berlin. De Valera heard the news and publicly went to express his sympathy to the Nazi representative in Dublin.
I think De Valera went to pay his condolences on the death of Hitler because of his extraordinarily formalistic and legalistic mind. Exactly the same kind of stuff that had created all the trouble around the Civil War about the nature of the state and the nature of an oath and formulas of words. He was a man who was very wedded to forms, and I think that was the ultimately demented expression of it.
It's the most stunning public relations disaster. Nobody could understand, I think, outside Ireland, almost precisely the moment when the scale of the horrors of the concentration camps were being revealed, that De Valera had to make this gesture in the German embassy.
In the flush of victory, Winston Churchill vented his pent-up disdain.
His Majesty's government never laid a violent hand upon them, though at times it would have been quite easy and quite natural. And we left the De Valera government to frolic with the German and later with the Japanese representatives to their heart's content.
De Valera broadcast a reply. It was measured, thoughtful.
Mr. Churchill is proud of Britain's stand alone after France had fallen and before America entered the war. Could he not find it in his heart the generosity to acknowledge that there is a small nation that stood alone, not for 1 year or two, but for several hundred years against aggression? A small nation that could never be got to accept defeat and has never surrendered for so.
The public received it ecstatically. For within Ireland, De Valera was the hero who had saved the country from bombs and averted potential political unrest. But for outside observers, the speech was De Valera at his most exasperating. A man so bound up with a mythical, heroic struggle for Irish nationalism that outside issues, whether they be the evils of Nazism or the solutions to his search for unity, were to him abstract. And the gulf between Ireland, north and south, was wider than ever.
The Second World War is in the first place, nothing can actually divide a country more than the simple fact that one part of it, the 6 countries in the northeast corner, are participating in this tremendous world war, and another part of it is neutral. It strengthens northern assumptions which are always there anyway about Irish nationalism, which is inward looking. It's always cultivating its historical grievances. It's always complaining about something that was done wrong to nationalists in the past, but is somehow indifferent to the big moral questions of the day.
I think there's no doubt that the closing of the doors on Ireland, when it tried to reach out to the outside world after the war, tried to join the United Nations, was intended to be a form of punishment. It was saying, in effect, all right, you want to be a small country, shut in, isolated from the great moral issues of the world, you can stay shut in your little country.
When the war ended, De Valera was 62 and rapidly losing his eyesight. But he was to remain a dominant force in Irish politics, in and out of government, and then as president of the country for nearly 30 years more.
De Valera's real problem, it could be argued, was that he stayed on as Prime Minister, as Taoiseach, for too long.